Phantom Nightmare is here, and you need to know which hand traps are the most important to beat the best meta decks. What's potion? You got Matt here, and welcome back to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video. Today we're talking about hand traps post Phantom Nightmare and how they interact with the best meta decks. The new releases in Phantom Nightmare are going to drastically change the format, and we're all trying to figure out what to do against the best meta decks, and this video should help with that. So if you're excited for the video, then make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 250 likes, then I'll bring you a guide to the best board breakers post Phantom Nightmare. Also, if you like deck profiles, combo guides, meta discussions, and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos just like this one, you're gonna love this channel. So make sure to subscribe and help us reach our new goal of 7,500 subscribers. But with that being said, here is the ultimate guide to the best hand traps in the post-Phantom Nightmare competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. Let's jump into it. So the first thing we have to do is figure out what categories we're going to cover when talking about these hand traps. As always, I have 6 categories for you guys. I have playable in most main decks, playable in some main decks, playable in most side decks, playable in some side decks, as well as our 2 favorites, the niche category and just don't. Just don't is going to be for cards that should not be played in pretty much any circumstance, while niche do have some applications even though they're very few and far between. Before I begin, I want to clarify something. If I place a card in a certain tier list, that doesn't mean it's inherently a better card than a card that's in a different tier. For example, if I place a card in the some main decks tier, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a better card than a card that would land in the most side decks tier, for example. And the reason why is because that could be a card that's just playable in very few decks, but in those decks it's exceptionally well, versus a card that's in most side decks can be played in a wider range of options but won't be played in the main deck in those options. Anyways, let's get on with the list, and starting off in alphabetical order, as always, is going to be Artifact Lancea. Now, Lancea has fallen off quite a bit since its prime because not many decks care too much about banishing as part of their effects in this format right now. But looking at Voiceless Voice, which will also be one of the better decks next format, that deck does like a little bit of banishing, mostly through like Saphira in Graveyard to be honest, but in reality, the other decks that are in the format right now, like the Runic variants for example, those are the ones that really care more about not being able to banish cards. So just because of how popular Runic decks are right now, it deserves some consideration. So I'll put it in the niche tier. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring has been a staple card in the most main decks tier for as long as I've been doing this tier list, and honestly probably as long as it's actually been legal. It can be used well against pretty much every deck in the format. It's good against Fire King Island for example, Snake Eye Ash, or even Snake Eye Populace for that matter. It's also great against something like Imseti for the Horus decks. It's great against Big Welcome Labyrinth and Welcome Labyrinth, pre-preparation of rights for something like Voiceless Voice, Branded Fusion of course, and so much more. The biggest concern I have with Ash Blossom is that as a card itself, while it's a fantastic option, it's not always going to be that good against all the different decks. Yeah, it can be used against all of them, but is it going to be impactful enough to make it worthwhile? Every deck only has a limited amount of spots to use for their hand trap space, so if Ash Blossom is going to make it in there, it has to make sense. And personally, I think there are going to be better options than Ash Blossom in this format considering what it actually does against these decks. I was heavily considering putting Ash in the most main decks tier, but because of the lower impact it has compared to some other options, I'm actually going to put it in the some main decks tier. Moving on to the Bystials in both Magnamut and Druisworm. Bystials have always been cards that are very format reliant. They either thrive on light or dark based formats, and right now we're in a very heavy fire based format, so they're not going to be as powerful. However, any deck that wants to play the Diabellstar engine for example will have to deal with Bystials at some point or another. In my opinion, Bystials aren't cards you should be side decking. If you're going to be playing them, it's going to be in the main deck as part of your main engine. However, those main engines are going to be pretty limited. It's going to be branded with like Bystial Serenir for example, and any of them for Dragon Link. So unless Bystials are part of your actual engine, they belong in the niche tier. As for Chaos Hunter, we've already established when talking about Artifact Lancea that banishing cards is not that important right now. Most strategies are more than happy to keep their cards in the graveyard, but on top of that, Chaos Hunter turns on Thrust and Talents, which can be absolutely detrimental against pretty much any strategy. There is a situation that can come up, but it's so rare that it'll actually happen. For example, if your opponent decides to special summon out a copy of SP Little Knight, you can then summon the copy of Chaos Angel in response to its effect to banish a card, and then they just can't banish that card anymore. But that comes up so rarely, so honestly, just don't play it. Next up is Contact C. Now sure, Contact C has a lot of utility in stopping people from using some more specific extra deck monsters. However, right now there are so many good generic extra deck cards available that it really doesn't do too much. What should be a card that will just prevent your opponent from doing something ends up being a card that gives them extra advantage and gives them an extra buy to go into something like an IP Masquerena, an SP Little Knight, or whatever the case might be. And on top of that, it's a level 6 monster, meaning it's easy access to Beatrice, which is one of the most oppressive cards in the game today. So for that reason, just don't play this card. DD Crow is great this format. One of the advantages that it has over other hand traps is that it can do something against pretty much every single deck. It can stop Barong from searching in the standby phase, it shuts down Poplar's ability to summon itself back to the spell and trap zone. If Snake Eye Flamber's Dragon is sent to the graveyard and there are only 2 level 1 fires there, if you banish one of them, then they can't summon back either of them, which is really nice. It's great against Big Welcome Labyrinth in the graveyard to stop it from bouncing a card back to hand, and there's so much more as well. Honestly, I can make an argument that it should see play against pretty much every single deck in the format, but with that being said, it should only see play in some main decks. Moving on to Dimension Shifter. I think Shifter is the face of this next tier, and honestly that's going to be the case until it probably gets banned. Now Shifter is an incredible card, but not every deck can play it. But the decks that can play it, they absolutely love it. It's awesome against decks like Fire King, Snake Eye, and even Tearlament, which won the first YCS of the year. Honestly, any deck that doesn't actually use the card itself is at least a little bit annoyed by it at the worst case. So while I'd argue it's one of the best hand traps today, it's only going to see play in some main decks. Now for Droll and Lockbird. I'm going to give it away early, but in my opinion, Droll is the best hand trap in the format, period. Why though? Well, Droll does something that most hand traps can't actually do, and that's going to be to end a turn in an instant. Oh, you search for Snake Eye Ash off the effect of Bonfire? Droll. You summon Ponix to get you Sanctuary and later on to Island? Nope. Droll. Now Island can't search or destroy a card. Oh, you're on Runic. Go ahead and add Fountain. Droll. Now you can't draw this turn. It's good against Vanquished Soul, Kashtira, Dragons, and there's so many other decks it's good against too. That's why I think it's the best hand trap in the post-Phantom Nightmare competitive format, and it should see play in most main decks. As for Effect Veiler, now listen, Effect Negation in general will always be pretty good for one reason or another pretty much for the rest of time, but the reason why I don't really like Veiler too much this format is because it turns on Thrust and Talent, and the reason it does that is because not only is it a monster card, but it can only be used on your opponent's turn, specifically during their main phase. Also, there are just better cards that basically do the exact same thing, so for that reason I'll put Veiler in the some side decks tier. After covering Veiler, I like to move on and start talking about Infinite Impermanence since they're so similar. The problem is, right now, the similarities are kind of ending, and the reason why is because Triple Tactics Thrust and Triple Tactics Talents are turned on by Veiler, but not by Infinite Impermanence. And there's two more things that are even more important than that. The first is going to be that it can be used during any phase of the game. The reason why that's so important is because you can use it, for example, during the draw phase to prevent an effect that would activate during the main phase only. That's a really good way to stop opponents from being able to do something. And the second thing is that it can be used as a board breaker as well. It's not as powerful as Droll and Lockbird is this format, but it's still a very good hand trap and belongs in the most main decks tier. Fantastical Dragon Fantastical is getting a reprint in just a few months in Rarity Collection 2, and it's for good reason. The card is very strong in the format today, but not for the reason that you would expect. I don't think the card will ever see play in the main deck ever again because not every deck utilizes Link monsters. However, right now, Promethean Princess is going to be the most popular Link monster in the game probably after SP Little Knight, which means that every fire deck is going to want to play that card. So if you have a Phantazmay in your hand, it's a very easy way for you to summon it out and get an extra way to dig through your deck to find the more impactful card. On top of that, the protection effect that Phantazmay has from targeting is really good, especially because a card like SP Little Knight and Promethean Princess do happen to target, to destroy, or banish. We've seen so many top players play Phantazmay in their side deck as a way to dig through their deck to see even more side deck cards. For that reason, Phantazmay should see play in most side decks. Ghost Belle is really good this format. It's honestly a fantastic card against so many different decks. It's good against Labyrinth for Big Welcome, it's good against Fire King, it's good against Snake Eye, it's even good against Runic and more. And while I do believe the card is good, some people are going to want to play it in the main deck, and I personally believe that in this format, that's a mistake. Looking at our tier list, we already have 5 different cards in the most and some main decks tier. Now, be honest, are you going to play Ghost Belle over any of these 5 cards? Probably the only ones you can make an argument for are going to be Dimension Shifter if your deck can't play it, and of course DD Crow. Ash Blossom, Imperm, and Droll are just too good for it to have a spot in the most or some main decks tier. So only because most decks don't have 12 to 15 spaces for hand traps, I'm placing Belle in the most side decks tier. Ghost Mourner is more effect negation, and it gives you the advantage of increasing your life points as well. The problem is, it's definitely the worst of all 3 options that have targeted effect negation in this format in Effect Veiler, Infinite Impermanence, and itself. Honestly, the only time this card would see play is if you have a deck that has a lot of space for hand traps and you definitely want to have access to another card that'll be able to do targeted effect negation while being able to be used on either player's turn, and if you have a monster on the field. I won't put it in niche just yet, but for the time being, it belongs in the some side decks tier. I like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit as a card a lot. The problem with it is that it's just not good enough against enough decks in the format today. Its utility has really fallen off significantly from its prime. It'll still make small appearances here and there, but it lacks the power to be used consistently across the board. But it still has some value, so for now I'll keep it in the niche tier. In theory, Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries can be very good, especially in the mirror match. The problem is, in the tier 0 format, the Tearlament 0 format that is, we saw people wanting to play this card to be able to banish an opponent's copy of Kid Kalos. But that never really happened because the card just wasn't impactful enough to get the job done. There's nothing right now that's as dominant as Tearlament was, so for that reason, just don't play it. As for Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood, I've been pretty hard on this card for the past couple of months, and honestly I think it's for good reason, but I won't deny that it does have some utility. Now that utility is mostly going to be happening later in a round, usually in Game 3. So while it's a useless card in Master Duel and in a more relaxed tournament where time isn't a big factor, I have to place it into some side decks tier. As for Gnomaterial, I won't spend very long on it, just don't play it. Nibiru is a very strong card in the post-Phantom Nightmare format. Now, while it only does one thing, it does that one thing very well. The only time it could be a problem is because most of the time it won't answer a board on its own, but I am going to rank it very highly because it's one of the few hand traps in the entire game along with Droll and Lockbird that can just end a turn in an instant. It's also rarely a dead card because most decks in the format today summon at least 5 times on their given turn. Now, some decks do have lines that can play around it or through it, but honestly, that's few and far between, especially when paired with another hand trap like Droll or Ash or Imperm or Ghost Mourner or whatever. And if they do play around it and you don't have it, a lot of the time they create a suboptimal board that'll give you a better chance to win a game. Just the threat of Nibiru being in the format and being good this format is so critical against a lot of different decks. It's an excellent card right now, but I don't see it as a card that should see play over something like Droll, Imperm, and even Ash Blossom. So for the time being, I'll place Nibiru in the some main decks tier. Very few decks can actually play PSY-Framegear Gamma that well, but when they can, it's obviously very strong. But because of how few decks can actually use it, it's niche. As for Retaliating C, you can technically use it against a lot of different decks this format, but honestly, no one really cares about it too much. The impact it has compared to other cards on this list is so minimal, and it really is just not the format for Retaliating C, so for that reason, just don't play it. Sauravis, the Ancient and Ascended, is going to start seeing a lot more play thanks to the new Voiceless Voice archetype. They play it as actually part of their main engine, which is really cool. But with that being said, that means there's only one meta deck that actually uses it as part of their engine. Every other deck that uses it kind of wants it as like an anti-hand trap to stop from being hand trapped themselves. So with that being said, I'm going to place it in the niche tier. I realize that Meister will probably see some small amount of play here and there, but honestly, why would you? Everything that activates in the graveyard this format can be stopped by something like Ghost Belle or Ash Blossom or even DD Crow, so for that reason, just don't play Meister. Just don't play Token Collector. This is the first time I'm adding a new hand trap to the tier list. Veidos, the Eruption Dragon of Extinction, is an awesome card, especially against decks that utilize field spells. Now granted, we are in a very heavy field spell reliant format right now. I don't think it'll actually see a lot of play, but the reason for that has nothing to do with the field spells themselves, it has more to do with the cards that protect those field spells. Fire King Sanctuary protects Island, Hugin protects Runic Fountain. Those are the two most prevalent field spells right now, and Veidos can't destroy them, which is obviously very problematic. So while I think it's going to be a staple eventually and going to be higher on this list, for the time being I'm placing it in niche. And that is it. My tier list for the best hand traps in the post-Phantom Nightmare competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format is looking like this over here. Now let me know down in the comments, what do you think of the list, and do you think I made any mistakes? I'd love to hear from you. And if you made it this far in the video, you must have enjoyed it, so do me a favor and smash the like button. Remember, if this video hits 250 likes, then I'll bring you the ultimate guide to the best board breakers in the post-Phantom Nightmare competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format and how they interact with the best meta decks. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and join our new Discord server. The links are down in the description, and of course, subscribe to the channel as well for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos and help us reach our new goal of 7,500 subscribers. But with that being said, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.